In the summer of 2005, New Orleans was a city that believed it was safe. Not perfectly safe, but safe enough. The levee system that encircled the bowl-shaped metropolis had been upgraded, reinforced, and certified. Federal engineers had assured local officials. Local officials had assured residents. The message was consistent. The city could withstand a major hurricane. This was not blind faith. It was based on decades of construction, billions in federal investment, and the authority of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. When people looked at the concrete floodwalls and earthen barriers that surrounded their neighborhoods, they saw protection. When meteorologists began tracking a tropical depression that would become Hurricane Katrina, there was concern, but not panic about the levees. The threat was wind. The threat was storm surge in coastal areas. But the levees? The levees were supposed to hold. Families made decisions based on this assumption. The calculus of risk was built on the premise that the infrastructure would function as designed. The system existed, it was real, it was there. And for a city that sat below sea level, surrounded by water on three sides, that system was everything. The levee system was not a single structure. It was a network. Miles of earthen levees, concrete floodwalls, drainage canals, and pumping stations, all designed to work together. The concept was straightforward: keep water out during storms, pump water out when it gets in. New Orleans exists in a depression. Rain doesn't drain naturally. Even in normal weather, the city relies on pumps to move water from streets into canals and from canals into Lake Pontchartrain or the Mississippi River. During a hurricane, the system had to do more. Storm surge could push water from the lake toward the city. Levees and floodwalls along the canals were meant to contain that surge. The pumps would handle rainwater. The walls would handle the lake. The system was rated for a Category 3 hurricane. That rating came with caveats, but the public understanding was simpler. Category 3 protection meant Category 3 safety. The Corps of Engineers had spent decades building this network. Residents did not design these structures. They trusted that the people who did had gotten it right.
Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the morning of August 29, 2005. By the time it reached New Orleans, it had weakened to a Category 3 storm. The city was on the weaker side of the hurricane. The worst winds stayed east. But the storm surge was massive. Water from the Gulf pushed into Lake Pontchartrain. The lake rose. Canals connecting the lake to the city began to swell. Water pressed against the floodwalls. Streets flooded from rain. Pumps began working, but power was failing. Backup generators kicked in at some stations. At others, they didn't. Water levels in the canals continued to rise. The pressure built. The storm was within the parameters the system was built to handle. The wind was not catastrophic. The surge was high, but not beyond the design threshold. For hours, the levees held. Then, they didn't. The 17th Street Canal floodwall failed first. Not at the top. The failure happened in the foundation. The wall moved, soil shifted. The entire section tilted and gave way, creating a breach. Water poured through, thousands of gallons per second, a torrent pouring into the Lakeview neighborhood. Residents who had stayed found themselves trapped as water rose with shocking speed. Some climbed into attics, some broke through roofs. The London Avenue Canal had two floodwalls. Both failed. Breaches opened on the east and west sides, flooding Gentilly and parts of the upper Ninth Ward. The Industrial Canal, separating the lower Ninth Ward from the rest of the city, also breached. Water smashed through and into a neighborhood already flooded by rain. The water came in layers, first the rain, then the breaches. Each new failure compounded the last. The city was not being slowly inundated, it was being rapidly filled.
This distinction is critical. A city that floods from rain stops flooding when the rain stops. A city that floods through breaches does not stop until the breaches are closed or the water reaches equilibrium. New Orleans was filling through holes in its defenses. Water sought its level. Lake Pontchartrain and the city's interior were connected by open wounds in the levee system. The depth of flooding in some neighborhoods reached the same height as the water in the canals, because it was the same water. The lower Ninth Ward filled until homes were submerged to their roof lines. Lakeview disappeared under brown water. 80% of the city was underwater, but not because 80% of the city had been hit by storm surge. Most of it had been protected from the storm itself. The flooding came from inside the protection system. The breaches turned the levees into dams that trapped water in rather than keeping it out.
The water did not recede. Days passed. The floodwater remained stagnant and toxic. The pumps that normally drained the city were underwater themselves or without power, were damaged. Even functional pumps couldn't work. They expelled water into the same canals that were feeding the breaches. Pumping water back into Lake Pontchartrain while the lake was still pouring into the city through broken flood walls was futile. The breaches had to be sealed first. That required equipment, materials, and access to breach sites that were submerged or surrounded by floodwater. Helicopters began dropping sandbags and rock. It was slow work. Each day the water remained, the damage deepened. Wooden structures soaked and swelled. Drywall dissolved. Mold began growing within 48 hours. Contamination spread. Sewage, chemicals, oil, debris. What had been neighborhoods became toxic lakes. Time was the hidden multiplier of destruction.
Within weeks, investigators descended on New Orleans. Teams from the Army Corps of Engineers, independent researchers, and forensic engineers examined the failed flood walls. What they found was damning. The 17th Street Canal flood wall had failed because of a design flaw. The pilings beneath the wall were too short. The soil composition had been misjudged. The wall was not built to the specifications required for the loads it would face. It did not fail because the storm exceeded its rating. It failed because it was never capable of meeting that rating in the first place. Similar findings emerged from investigations of the London Avenue Canal breaches. Inadequate pilings, poor soil analysis, construction that did not match design intent. These were not acts of God. These were engineering failures, compounded by oversight failures, compounded by institutional failures. The Corps of Engineers eventually took responsibility. Official reports confirmed what survivors had suspected. The levees did not fail because Katrina was too strong. They failed because the levees were too weak. New Orleans rebuilt its levee system. The new construction was stronger, higher, more robust. The pumps were upgraded. The flood walls were redesigned. Billions of dollars poured into infrastructure that should have been right the first time. But something else changed, something harder to measure. Trust collapsed. Residents who returned did so with the knowledge that they had been failed, not by nature, but by institutions that promised protection and delivered vulnerability. The psychological damage was permanent. People who had based life decisions on assurances from engineers now knew those assurances could be catastrophically wrong. The city's relationship with water, with risk, with federal promises, all of it shifted. New Orleans survived. It came back. But it came back different, shaped not just by the flood, but by the betrayal embedded in that flood. The storm passed in hours. The failure defined a generation.